It all started on a crisp Sunday afternoon, the kind of day where the cool breeze carried the faint aroma of freshly cut grass. The whole family was gathered in my parents' living room, sipping tea and chatting about mundane things like the neighbor's new car and Uncle Orin's infamous barbecue mishap. I was leaning back on the old leather couch, trying to tune out the noise, when Seraphina cleared her throat. It wasn't an ordinary throat clearing. It was the kind that demanded attention. I looked up, instantly alert. Whenever Seraphina had something to say, it was usually dramatic. "I need to talk to you," she said, her gaze laser-focused on me. The room quieted, heads turned, and my stomach dropped. Seraphina was the baby of the family, the golden child who somehow always managed to get her way. I braced myself. She started with a sigh, her voice tinged with faux vulnerability. "You know how hard it's been for me since high school. I've been trying to figure out my future, and I've decided I want to go to college." I blinked. Seraphina had spent the last few years bouncing between part-time jobs, quitting whenever they got too hard. The idea of her committing to 4 years of study seemed unlikely, but I held my tongue. "That's great," I replied cautiously. "What are you planning to study?" She waved her hand dismissively. "I'm still deciding. That's not the point. The thing is..." She hesitated, glancing around the room for effect. "I need help paying for it." There it was. The room, already quiet, seemed to grow even stiller. My parents exchanged uneasy glances, and I felt their silent plea for me to respond. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Seraphina," I began slowly, "college is expensive. Have you looked into scholarships, financial aid?" Her expression shifted, annoyance flickering beneath her carefully composed facade. "I'm not eligible for most scholarships, and financial aid barely covers anything. I was hoping... Well, since you're doing so well, maybe you could help me out." I felt the words land like a punch. She didn't just ask for help. She demanded it, her tone laced with the assumption that it was my duty as her older sibling. My chest tightened, anger bubbling just below the surface. I had worked tirelessly to get where I was. Long hours, late nights, and sacrifices I doubted Seraphina could even comprehend. "I don't know, Seraphina," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Paying for college is a big commitment. Have you thought about getting a part-time job to save up?" Her eyes flashed with irritation. "You don't get it. I can't save up enough to make a dent in tuition. You can afford it. You're my older sibling. It's your job to help me." Her words stung, not because they were true, but because they were so blatantly unfair. The room was heavy with tension, everyone waiting to see how I'd respond. I glanced at my parents, hoping for backup, but they avoided my gaze. My dad coughed awkwardly, and my mom gave me a look that said, "It's up to you." I took a deep breath, my mind racing. How had we come to this? When had my success become a burden, an unspoken obligation to bail Seraphina out? I stared at her, trying to find the right words, but before I could speak, she added, "You don't have to decide right now. Just think about it." Her tone was sweet now, almost sickeningly so, as if she hadn't just tossed a grenade into the middle of the room. I nodded stiffly, my thoughts a swirling storm of frustration and disbelief. As the conversation shifted to lighter topics, I sat there, barely listening, my mind already calculating the consequences of saying no. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a tangled web of secrets and lies that would change everything. Over the next few days, Seraphina's request lingered in my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. I replayed her words over and over, dissecting the subtle digs and manipulative undertones. She had always been good at twisting situations to suit her needs, but this time felt different, bigger, heavier. The idea of paying for her college felt less like a favor and more like a demand disguised as a plea. On Wednesday evening, I decided to clear my head with a walk. The late autumn air was cool, and the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot was oddly soothing. I tried to focus on anything else, but Seraphina's voice kept echoing in my thoughts. "You're my older sibling. It's your job to help me." Was it, though? Was it really my job to shoulder her responsibilities, especially when she had made no effort to help herself? I was still lost in thought when I returned home and saw a familiar car parked in my driveway. Seraphina's cherry red convertible, an impulsive birthday gift from our parents years ago, gleamed under the streetlights. My stomach sank. She hadn't warned me she was coming over. I stepped inside to find her sitting cross-legged on my couch, scrolling through her phone as if she owned the place. She looked up with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hey, big brother," she chirped. "I brought us some takeout." She gestured to the kitchen counter, where 2 neatly packed containers sat. The smell of spicy noodles filled the air. I sighed, shrugging off my coat. "Seraphina, what are you doing here?" Her smile faltered for a moment, but she recovered quickly. "I thought we could talk, about the whole college thing. I didn't want to pressure you in front of everyone, but I know you probably need time to process." I folded my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "I haven't made a decision yet." She tilted her head, her voice taking on a sweet, almost saccharine tone. "Of course, and I don't want to rush you. I feel like this is such a great opportunity for me, and you're in such a good position to help. It's like fate, I bit back a sharp retort. Seraphina had always had a way of wrapping her selfishness in pretty packaging. Instead, I asked, "Have you actually looked into any scholarships or financial aid programs?" Her smile tightened. "I told you, I don't qualify for most of them. And even if I did, it wouldn't be enough. College is ridiculously expensive, and with everything going on..." She trailed off, looking down at her phone as if the conversation bored her. My patience was wearing thin. "Seraphina, this isn't something I can just decide overnight. And frankly, I need to know you're serious about this before I even consider it. College isn't just about money. It's about commitment. You can't quit halfway through like you've done with everything else." Her eyes flashed with anger. "That's not fair. I've had a hard time finding my path." "Everyone does," I said evenly. "But not everyone expects someone else to fix it for them." Her face turned red, and for a moment, I thought she might explode. Instead, she stood abruptly, grabbing her bag. "You're unbelievable," she hissed. "You have all this money, and you can't even help your own sister. Do you have any idea how selfish you sound?" I watched as she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't guilt that gripped me. It was anger. For years, Seraphina had skated through life, leaning on everyone else to clean up her messes. Maybe it was time someone said no. But as I cleaned up the untouched takeout, something about her outburst nagged at me. Seraphina was a lot of things, spoiled, entitled, impulsive. But there had been something else in her voice tonight. Desperation. Panic. Like she was hiding something bigger than just a college dream. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Seraphina's request than she was letting on. Little did I know, the truth was about to come crashing down in a way I never expected. The next morning, I couldn't shake the unease from the night before. Seraphina's sudden urgency, her defensiveness, it all felt off. She wasn't just pushing for help, she was scrambling for something. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew one thing. There was more to this story than she was letting on. Later that afternoon, I decided to stop by our parents' house. My mother greeted me at the door, her warm smile doing little to quell the tension in my chest. The house smelled of her signature apple pie, and for a brief moment, I wished I could go back to simpler times when family gatherings didn't feel like battlefields. As we sat in the living room, I cut straight to the point. "Did Seraphina talk to you about this college thing?" My mother sighed, folding her hands in her lap. "She did," she admitted. "She mentioned you seemed hesitant to help." Of course she had. "Mom, do you really think it's fair for her to expect me to pay for everything?" "She's your sister," my mother said gently, though her tone carried a hint of reproach. "We've always helped each other in this family." I felt the frustration bubbling up again. Helped each other? Or helped Seraphina? Because from where I'm standing, it seems like she's the only one who's always being bailed out. Before my mother could respond, my father entered the room. "What's this about Seraphina now?" he asked, settling into his recliner. I explained the situation, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. When I finished, my father sighed heavily, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Your sister has always been sensitive," he said diplomatically. "But I don't think she's trying to take advantage of you." "Dad," I said, exasperated, "she's asking me to drop tens of thousands of dollars on a commitment she hasn't even proven she can handle. And what happens when she changes her mind in 6 months? You know as well as I do that she has a track record of quitting." My father exchanged a look with my mother, and something passed between them, something unsaid. My stomach sank. "What aren't you telling me?" My mother shifted uncomfortably. "It's not our place." "She's in trouble, isn't she?" I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. They didn't answer, but their silence was all the confirmation I needed. My mind raced through the possibilities. Debt? Bad decisions? Something worse? Seraphina's desperation suddenly made sense. This wasn't just about college, it was about covering up something. "I need to know what's going on," I demanded. "If you know something, you have to tell me." My father leaned forward, his expression grave. "We don't know everything, but she's been having financial difficulties. She's mentioned being behind on some payments, but she won't say what kind. She's been very secretive." "Financial difficulties?" I repeated, incredulous. "She drives a convertible and shops like she's a millionaire." "We've told her the same thing," my mother said quietly. "But Seraphina always finds a way to smooth things over. She says she has it under control." I stood up, pacing the room. "Control?" "She came to me for money because she has nothing under control. Why won't anyone hold her accountable?" "She's your sister," my mother said softly. "She needs support, not judgment." I stopped pacing, my hands clenched into fists. Support is one thing, enabling her is another. As I left the house, my parents' words echoed in my head. Financial difficulties, secretive payments. Seraphina wasn't asking for help. She was trying to dig herself out of a hole. And I had a sinking feeling that hole was deeper than any of us realized. Determined to get answers, I decided to dig into Seraphina's life myself. If she wasn't going to come clean, I'd find the truth on my own. And if what I suspected was true, this was going to get a lot messier before it got better. That evening, I sat down at my desk, determination coursing through me. If Seraphina wasn't going to be honest, I'd have to figure it out myself. My first thought was to check her social media. Seraphina loved to flaunt her life online. Lavish dinners, expensive clothes, weekend getaways. It was all there, curated to look perfect. But now, those posts felt like breadcrumbs leading to something far less glamorous. As I scrolled, I noticed a pattern. Over the past 6 months, her posts had shifted. The extravagant shopping hauls and flashy outings had dwindled, replaced by vague motivational captions about starting fresh and new beginnings. The timeline fit perfectly with her sudden interest in college. Something had clearly changed, and she was trying to mask it. I decided to take it a step further. Digging through my emails, I found an old shared login for a family streaming account. Seraphina was notorious for reusing passwords, and I figured it was worth a shot. Sure enough, it worked. I logged into her email, my heart pounding with guilt and curiosity. I knew it wasn't the most ethical move, but Seraphina had left me no choice. Her inbox was a mess. Promotions, newsletters, random subscriptions. But buried among the clutter were the red flags I had been expecting. Payment reminders, overdue notices, credit card balances that made my stomach churn. One email in particular caught my eye. Final warning, account delinquent. The sender was a luxury fashion retailer. I opened it, my pulse quickening. The email was blunt. Seraphina owed thousands of dollars. The balance was months overdue, and the company was threatening to send the account to collections. There were similar emails from other companies, designer brands, high-end boutiques. It wasn't just one account. It was a mountain of debt. My mind raced. How had she managed to dig herself into such a massive financial hole, and why hadn't she asked for help sooner? As I clicked through the emails, I noticed something else. Many of the charges were recent, within the last few months. Even as her financial situation worsened, she hadn't stopped spending. Then I stumbled across a folder labeled Receipts. My curiosity outweighed my hesitation as I opened it. Inside were dozens of screenshots of online orders, each one more extravagant than the last. Designer handbags, limited edition sneakers, luxury skincare. One order totaled more than I earned in a month. But what stood out most was the sheer volume. Seraphina wasn't just shopping, she was compulsively buying. I sat back in my chair, my head spinning. This wasn't just irresponsibility, it was something deeper, a habit, an addiction. Seraphina was drowning, and instead of asking for a life raft, she was trying to cover it up with a facade of normalcy. I stared at the screen, torn between anger and pity. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to demand an explanation. But another part of me realized she might not even see the full scope of her problem. She had spent so long pretending everything was fine that she might believe it herself. As I closed her email, a wave of dread washed over me. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about trust. Seraphina had lied to me, to our family, and probably to herself. And now, I was the one left holding the truth. I knew what I had to do, but it wouldn't be easy. If I exposed Seraphina's secret, it would shatter the image she had built, not just for herself, but for everyone around her. And yet, if I stayed silent, I'd be complicit in her spiral. Either way, there was no going back. This was the point of no return. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of resolve and unease battling in my chest. I couldn't let Seraphina keep sinking into this mess, but confronting her felt like stepping into a minefield. I'd spent years tiptoeing around her sensitivities, but this time was different. This wasn't just another one of her impulsive decisions. It was a full-blown crisis. I decided to start by gathering more information, hoping it would give me the leverage I needed to approach her. I headed over to my parents' house again, knowing Seraphina wasn't likely to be there this early. My mother was in the kitchen, humming softly as she peeled apples. She greeted me with a warm smile, but it faltered when she saw the seriousness on my face. "Is something wrong, sweetheart?" she asked, setting the knife down. I sat down at the table, debating how much to say. "Mom, I think Seraphina's in deeper trouble than she's letting on." She sighed, her shoulders sagging. "We've suspected it too. She's been so distant lately, and whenever we ask if everything's okay, she brushes it off." "Have you noticed anything specific?" I pressed. "Anything unusual about her spending habits or behavior?" My mother hesitated, glancing toward the doorway as if expecting Seraphina to walk in. "She's been borrowing money here and there," she admitted. "Small amounts at first. Your father and I thought it was just temporary, but lately it's been more frequent. And larger sums." "How much?" I asked, my voice tight. She looked down at her hands. "A few thousand. We didn't want to pry, but when we tried to ask why she needed it, she got defensive. She said it was for emergencies, but I'm not so sure." A few thousand. Combined with what I'd seen in her emails, it was clear that Seraphina was in over her head. "Mom, this isn't just about emergencies. She's in serious debt, and she hasn't been honest with any of us." Her eyes widened, the color draining from her face. "Debt? How do you know that?" "I found some emails," I admitted, choosing my words carefully. "She owes a lot of money to luxury brands and credit cards. This isn't just a rough patch, it's a pattern." My mother looked stricken, sinking into the chair across from me. I knew she was struggling, but I didn't think it was this bad. "What are we going to do?" Before I could answer, the front door opened, and we both froze. Seraphina walked in, her sunglasses perched on her head and a shopping bag in hand. The irony wasn't lost on me. She stopped short when she saw us, her expression shifting from surprise to suspicion. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone wary. "Seraphina," I began, standing up. "We need to talk." Her eyes narrowed. "About what?" I exchanged a glance with my mother, who looked as though she might cry. "About the truth," I said firmly. "About your spending, your debt. All of it." The color drained from her face, and for a moment she looked like a child caught stealing from the cookie jar. But then her expression hardened. "You went through my stuff," she demanded, her voice rising. "How dare you?" "I had to," I shot back, "because you weren't telling me or anyone the truth. Seraphina, you're drowning, and instead of asking for real help, you're dragging everyone else down with you." Her lip quivered, but her anger burned brighter. "You don't understand," she snapped. "You don't know what it's like to feel trapped, to have everyone expect you to be perfect all the time." "Perfect?" I laughed bitterly. "Seraphina, no one's expecting you to be perfect. We just want you to be honest. Instead, you've been lying to us. To me." Her eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "You think you're so much better than me because you have everything figured out," she said, her voice breaking. "But you have no idea what it's like to feel like a failure every single day." Her words hit harder than I expected, and for a moment I saw her not as the manipulative, entitled sister I'd been angry with, but as someone deeply flawed and painfully human. But sympathy didn't erase the damage she'd caused. "Seraphina," I said softly, "if you want help, we're here. But it has to start with the truth. No more secrets." She looked at me for a long time, her defenses slowly crumbling. Finally, she sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad," she whispered. "I just didn't know how to stop." The room was heavy with silence, the weight of her admission sinking in. This wasn't the resolution I'd hoped for, but it was a start. And as much as I hated to admit it, this was only the beginning of the road to fixing what had been broken. The silence in the room felt suffocating, broken only by the faint sound of Seraphina's quiet sobs. My mother reached out hesitantly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out," she said softly, her voice wavering. "But you have to let us help you." Seraphina wiped her face with trembling hands, avoiding eye contact. "You don't understand. It's not just the debt. It's everything." I kept thinking I'd catch up, but every time I tried, something else would go wrong. I leaned against the table, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. "What do you mean by everything? How much trouble are you in?" She hesitated, glancing between me and Mom as though weighing whether she could trust us. Finally, she exhaled shakily. "It started small. I'd buy a bag or a pair of shoes to cheer myself up after a bad day. Then I'd see something else, and I'd tell myself it was okay because I deserved it. I had no idea how fast it would add up." Her voice broke, and she looked down at her lap, twisting her fingers nervously. "When I maxed out my first credit card, I thought it was no big deal. I figured I'd just pay it off little by little, but then another bill would come, and I'd already spent too much. I opened a second card to cover the first, and, well, it spiraled from there." My mother gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Seraphina, why didn't you tell us sooner?" "I was embarrassed," she snapped, her frustration bubbling over. "Do you know how humiliating it is to admit that you've screwed up so badly? And you—" She turned her gaze to me, her eyes flashing with resentment. "You've always had everything together. I didn't want you to look at me like a failure." Her words stung, but I refused to let them derail the conversation. "This isn't about me, Seraphina. This is about you hiding a problem until it became impossible to ignore. Do you even know how much you owe?" She flinched, her bravado crumbling once more. "Around 30,000, she whispered, barely audible. The number hit me like a slap. 30,000? I repeated, incredulous. "Seraphina, that's not just trouble. That's a disaster." Her shoulders slumped, and she buried her face in her hands again. I know I messed up. But I didn't know what else to do. That's why I asked for help with college. I thought if I could just start over, get a degree, get a real job, I could fix everything." I exchanged a glance with my mother, who looked pale and shaken. It was clear that Seraphina's request wasn't just about education, it was about escaping the mess she'd created. But her plan was a bandage on a wound that needed stitches. "Seraphina," I said, my tone firm but not unkind, "you can't fix this by running away from it. If you want to turn things around, you need to face it head on. That means coming clean about all of it. No more half-truths, no more secrets." She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "And then what?" "What do I do after that?" "You start by taking responsibility," I said, meeting her gaze. "You don't have to do it alone, but you do have to take the first step. That means making a plan to pay off your debt, cutting back on spending, and, if necessary, getting professional help." My mother nodded, her voice steadier now. "We can support you, sweetie, but you have to be willing to put in the effort. This won't be easy, but it's not impossible." Seraphina sat there, her expression shifting between fear and reluctant hope. Finally, she nodded, though her movements were hesitant. "Okay," she murmured. "I'll do it. I don't know how, but I'll try." It wasn't the triumphant resolution I'd hoped for, but it was something, a crack in the wall she'd built around herself. As much as I wanted to feel relief, I knew this was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey. The truth was out, but now came the hard part: rebuilding trust, repairing the damage, and helping Seraphina learn how to stand on her own. The days that followed were tense, filled with conversations that swung between awkward, heartfelt, and confrontational. Seraphina had agreed to let me help her review her finances, though her reluctance was obvious. The shame she carried clung to her like a shadow, and I could tell every number I uncovered felt like a punch to her gut. We sat at my kitchen table one evening, a stack of printed credit card statements and overdue notices spread between us. Seraphina sat across from me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as though trying to shield herself from the weight of her mistakes. "This one's maxed out," I said, tapping a statement from a luxury retail card. "And this one?" I flipped to another page. "You're almost at the limit here, too." She nodded mutely, her gaze fixed on the tabletop. "And these late fees," I continued, shaking my head, "they're snowballing. You're paying more in penalties than the actual balance." "I know," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've tried to keep up, but it's like every time I make a payment, I fall behind on something else." Her defeat was palpable, but I refused to let her sink into it. "The first thing we need to do is stop the bleeding," I said. "No more shopping, no more charging to these cards. Do you have anything left to sell? Anything you can return?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Most of the stuff I bought is either used or, well, not returnable." "Not returnable?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" She sighed, her cheeks flushing. "Some of it was secondhand, and some of it was, discounted. From resellers." I raised an eyebrow but didn't push further. It didn't matter where the stuff came from. It mattered that it was part of the problem. "Okay," I said, exhaling slowly. "Then we need to focus on what you can control." I pulled out a notebook and started jotting down a plan. "First, you're going to call these companies and negotiate a repayment plan. Some of them might be willing to lower your interest rates or waive fees if you agree to consistent payments." Her eyes widened. I didn't know I could do that. "You can," I assured her, "but it takes persistence. They're not going to make it easy, so you have to be prepared to stand your ground." She nodded hesitantly. "Okay. What else?" "You're going to get a job, any job. I don't care if it's part-time or full-time, but you need steady income. And while you're at it, we'll set up a budget. Every dollar you make goes toward your debt until it's under control." Her expression shifted, doubt creeping into her features. "But what about college? If I start working now, I'll never have time to go back to school." I leaned back in my chair, meeting her gaze. "Seraphina, college isn't off the table, but right now, it can't be the priority. You need to get your financial life in order first. Once you've done that, then we can talk about the next step." She bit her lip, clearly struggling to accept the reality of the situation. "What if I fail?" she asked after a long pause. "What if I try and it's still not enough?" "You won't fail," I said firmly. "Not if you're willing to put in the work, and you're not alone in this. Mom, Dad, and we're all here to help you. But you have to meet us halfway." For the first time in days, I saw a flicker of determination in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As we worked through her debts and discussed her next steps, I felt a mixture of frustration and hope. Frustration at how far she'd let things spiral out of control, and hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the wake-up call she needed to turn her life around. By the time she left that night, armed with a list of tasks and a tentative plan, I felt a strange sense of relief. The road ahead was still daunting, but for the first time, it felt like progress was possible. But deep down, a nagging thought lingered. What if this wasn't the whole story? What if there were still pieces of the puzzle Seraphina hadn't revealed? As much as I wanted to trust that she'd come clean, part of me couldn't shake the feeling that the worst wasn't over yet. A week passed, and to my surprise, Seraphina seemed to be taking the first steps toward turning her life around. She had started calling her creditors, and though she described the conversations as humiliating, she admitted that a few of them were willing to work with her. She'd also applied for several part-time jobs, even mentioning a promising interview at a local boutique. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was being left unsaid. There were moments in our conversations where her voice faltered or her gaze darted away, as though she was holding something back. I wanted to believe that she was being honest, but the nagging doubt in the back of my mind wouldn't go away. One evening, just as I was about to settle in with a book, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an old friend of mine, Evan, who worked in financial services. We hadn't talked in a while, so his message immediately caught my attention. "Hey, I think I saw your sister at my office the other day. Everything okay?" Confused, I replied quickly, asking what he meant. His response came almost immediately. "She was meeting with one of my coworkers about consolidating some debts. Looked stressed out. I didn't want to pry, but thought you should know." My stomach tightened. Seraphina hadn't mentioned anything about going to a financial advisor. If she was taking those steps, why keep it a secret? Unless, of course, there was more to her situation than she'd let on. I decided not to confront her directly, not yet. Instead, I called Evan and asked if he could tell me anything more. He was hesitant, citing confidentiality, but eventually he shared a crucial detail. "She mentioned something about a loan," he said carefully. "A personal loan she took out a while ago. It sounded significant." A loan? This was new information. Seraphina had never once mentioned a loan in any of our conversations about her debt. My mind raced. If she'd taken out a personal loan on top of her credit card debt, then the situation was far worse than she'd admitted. The next day, I invited her over under the pretense of discussing her repayment progress. She arrived looking tired but more composed than usual. As we sat down, I decided to ease into the topic. "So," I began casually, "how's everything going with the creditors? Any progress?" She nodded, sipping the coffee I'd made for her. "It's been okay, I guess. A few of them agreed to lower my interest rates, so that's something." "That's good to hear," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "And what about everything else? Any surprises?" Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, narrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are there any debts we haven't talked about yet? Anything else you need help with?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "No, I told you everything." I studied her carefully, the tension in the room growing thicker by the second. "Seraphina," I said softly but firmly, "I know about the loan." Her face froze, the color draining from her cheeks. For a moment, I thought she might deny it, but then she slumped back in her chair, covering her face with her hands. "How did you find out?" "It doesn't matter," I said, leaning forward. "What matters is that you didn't tell me. How much do you owe?" Her voice was barely audible. 15,000. I exhaled sharply, trying to keep my composure. 15,000 on top of the 30,000 you already owe? Seraphina, how could you hide this? I didn't know how to tell you, she cried, her voice breaking. I was already so ashamed about the credit cards, and the loan felt like my only way out. But it just made everything worse. Her admission was like a punch to the gut. She hadn't just been struggling. She'd been drowning, and every decision she made to fix it only pulled her deeper. I wanted to be furious, but more than anything, I felt an overwhelming sadness for her. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "Because I didn't want you to hate me," she said through tears. "You're the only person in this family who's always had it together, and I didn't want you to see how much of a mess I've made." Her words hit harder than I expected. For all her flaws, Seraphina had been carrying the weight of her own self-loathing, even as she dragged everyone else into her chaos. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Seraphina, I don't hate you. I'm frustrated, sure, but I don't hate you. What I hate is seeing you dig yourself into a deeper hole when there are people who want to help you." She nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted, her voice trembling. "We'll figure it out," I said firmly. "But it starts with complete honesty. No more secrets. Deal?" She hesitated, then nodded again. "Deal." It wasn't the resolution I wanted, but it was a step forward. Still, a part of me couldn't help but wonder what other truths Seraphina was hiding, and whether I'd ever know the full extent of her troubles. The weight of Seraphina's latest confession lingered in the air long after she left. $15,000 on a personal loan, added to her $30,000 in credit card debt, was more than I had imagined. She hadn't just been reckless, she'd been desperate, clawing for solutions that only buried her deeper. I couldn't shake the sinking feeling that there were still layers to her story I hadn't uncovered. The next day, I decided to dig further, not to invade her privacy, but to ensure I fully understood the mess I was trying to help her clean up. If she wasn't going to give me the whole truth voluntarily, I needed to prepare for the worst. I started with a basic credit check, something anyone could do with the right tools and consent. Luckily, Seraphina had begrudgingly handed over the necessary documents during our last talk. The report that came back was staggering. She wasn't just in debt. She was drowning in it. Aside from the credit cards and the personal loan, there were small high-interest payday loans she hadn't mentioned. One of them had an interest rate so outrageous, I could hardly believe it was legal. There were also medical bills from what appeared to be an ER visit a year ago. In total, her debt wasn't $45,000. It was closer to $60,000. The numbers swam before my eyes as I tried to make sense of it all. Payday loans, medical bills? She hadn't mentioned any of this. Why? Was she afraid? Embarrassed? Or was there something else, something bigger, she didn't want me to know? Determined to get answers, I decided to confront her directly. That evening, I called her and asked her to meet me for coffee at a quiet cafe downtown. She hesitated, but eventually agreed. When she arrived, her guarded expression told me she knew this wasn't a casual meeting. She sat across from me, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming mug. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. I didn't mince words. "Seraphina, I ran a credit check." Her eyes widened and she paled visibly. "You did what?" "I needed to understand the full picture," I said, keeping my tone calm but firm. "And now I do. The personal loan isn't the only thing you didn't tell me about. Payday loans, medical bills, you've been hiding a lot." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Finally, she slumped back in her chair. "I didn't think you'd find out," she admitted, her voice small. "That's the problem," I said. "You keep trying to fix everything on your own, and it's only making things worse. Why didn't you tell me about the payday loans? Or the medical bills?" Her gaze dropped to her lap. the payday loans. I was so behind on my credit cards that I needed money just to make the minimum payments. It was stupid, I know, but at the time, it felt like my only option. And the medical bills? I pressed. What happened? She hesitated, biting her lip. I went to the ER last year for chest pains, she said finally. I thought I was having a heart attack, but it turned out to be a panic attack. I didn't have insurance at the time, so the bills piled up. Her words hit me harder than I expected. A panic attack. It was hard to reconcile the carefree, impulsive Seraphina I'd grown up with and the anxious, overwhelmed person sitting in front of me. Why didn't you tell anyone? I asked, my voice softening. Because I didn't want anyone to worry, she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You were all so busy with your own lives, and I didn't want to be a burden. Seraphina, I said, leaning forward, you're not a burden. But keeping this from us only made things harder for you and for everyone else. You can't keep doing this. She nodded slowly, tears spilling over as she whispered, I'm sorry. I just didn't know how to ask for help. For the first time, I saw a glimmer of sincerity in her apology, a genuine acknowledgement of her mistakes. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about her finally confronting the fear and shame that had kept her trapped. I'll help you, I said after a long pause. But this time, it has to be different. No more hiding, no more secrets. We're going to make a plan, and you're going to stick to it. She sniffled, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her sweater. Okay, she said softly. I'll do whatever it takes. As we left the cafe that night, I felt a cautious sense of hope. Seraphina still had a long road ahead, but at least now she wasn't walking it alone. Still, one question lingered in the back of my mind, nagging at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. If she had hidden so much already, could I really trust that this was everything? Or was there still more waiting to unravel? Over the next few weeks, Seraphina and I worked on dismantling the financial disaster she had created. It wasn't easy. Every step forward seemed to unearth another layer of problems she hadn't disclosed. A missed payment here, an unexpected fee there. It was like trying to plug holes in a sinking ship. But to her credit, she was sticking to the plan. She had taken on 2 part-time jobs, one at a boutique and another at a local cafe. It was grueling work, but she showed up every day without complaint. It was the first time in years I'd seen her genuinely committed to something. One evening, after one of our weekly budget meetings, I noticed her lingering by the door. She had been quiet throughout our session, unusually so. I leaned back in my chair, watching as she fiddled with the strap of her purse. Is something on your mind? I asked. She hesitated, then looked up at me, her expression conflicted. There's something I need to tell you. My stomach sank. I had a bad feeling about this. Go on, I said, keeping my tone neutral. She took a deep breath, her fingers twisting nervously. I've been getting calls from someone, a guy I used to date. His name is Max. I frowned, confused. What does that have to do with anything? He loaned me money, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. A lot of money. The words hit me like a brick. What? How much? She winced, as though bracing herself for my reaction. About 10,000. I stared at her, struggling to process what I'd just heard. $10,000? Seraphina, why would you borrow that much from someone you were dating? I didn't have a choice, she said, her voice breaking. It was right after I maxed out my cards and got hit with those medical bills. I was desperate, and Max offered to help. He said I could pay him back whenever I could, but now he's been calling and asking for the money. I felt my temper flare. And you didn't think to mention this earlier? You've been sitting on this while we've been trying to fix everything else? I didn't know how to tell you, she said, tears welling up in her eyes. I was afraid you'd be furious. Well, you were right about that, I snapped, unable to hide my frustration. Seraphina, this changes everything. That's another 10,000 added to the pile. How are you supposed to pay him back on top of everything else? I don't know, she cried, her voice cracking. I've been trying to figure it out, but nothing I do is enough. He's starting to get impatient, and I'm scared he's going to show up at my job or something. Her fear was palpable, and as much as I wanted to stay angry, I couldn't ignore the genuine panic in her voice. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotion swirling inside me. Does Max have anything in writing? A contract? A promissory note? I asked. She shook her head. No, it was just verbal. But I don't think that matters. He's been calling nonstop, leaving messages about how he wants his money back. I rubbed my temples, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Okay, I said finally. First, you're going to stop answering his calls. If he shows up anywhere, you call me immediately. Understood? She nodded, her expression filled with a mix of relief and guilt. I'm sorry, she whispered. I've made such a mess of everything. You have, I said honestly, but we're going to figure it out, one step at a time. After she left, I sat alone in the quiet of my apartment, my mind racing. Seraphina's situation was spiraling faster than I could keep up with. The debt was one thing, but now there was a third party involved, a volatile variable that could complicate everything. I couldn't help but wonder how much worse things might get before they got better. And for the first time, I started to question whether Seraphina's problems were fixable at all, or if I was fighting a losing battle. The weight of Seraphina's latest revelation hung over me like a storm cloud. Max wasn't just another creditor in a spreadsheet. He was a wild card. A personal connection meant emotions were involved, and the vague sense of fear in Seraphina's voice told me he wasn't the type to let things slide. I didn't like the sound of it at all. The next day, Seraphina called me, her voice shaky. Max came by the cafe this morning. My grip on the phone tightened. What did he want? He was calm at first, she said, her voice wavering. He asked if I'd made any progress on getting the money. I told him I was working on it, but then he got frustrated. He said if I didn't figure something out soon, he'd start telling people about the loan. My chest tightened. Telling who? Your boss? Our family? I don't know, she whispered. He didn't say, but the way he looked at me, it scared me. Did he threaten you? I demanded. Not directly, but it felt like a warning, she admitted. I exhaled sharply, trying to rein in the anger bubbling inside me. Seraphina, this has to stop. We need to deal with him before this gets worse. How? She asked, her voice desperate. I don't have the money, and he's not the kind of guy you can reason with. Let me handle it, I said firmly. Give me his number. No, she said quickly. It'll only make things worse. Max won't back down, and if he thinks I dragged you into this, it'll just escalate. I hated how powerless her words made me feel. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about safety. But I couldn't force her to give me his number, not without making her feel even more cornered. Okay, I said, swallowing my frustration. Then we need a plan. Fast. The next few days were a whirlwind of damage control. I researched debt consolidation options for Seraphina, calling agencies and asking about payment plans that could lump all her debts into one manageable sum. It wouldn't solve the problem overnight, but it would stop the spiraling interest rates and give her some breathing room. At the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about Max. The more I thought about it, the more his behavior gnawed at me. I decided to do some digging. If Seraphina wasn't going to let me confront him directly, I needed to understand who I was dealing with. I found Max's social media profiles easily enough. They painted the picture of someone who loved to flaunt his wealth, pictures of expensive cars, vacations in exotic locations, nights out at high-end clubs. But the deeper I scrolled, the more cracks I saw in the facade. Comments from friends hinted at unpaid tabs and falling outs over money. A few posts even suggested he had borrowed from others and never paid them back. It became clear that Max wasn't the successful, generous guy Seraphina had likely believed him to be. He was a leech, preying on people who trusted him, and now he had her in his grip. I saved screenshots of everything I found, knowing they might come in handy. If Max tried to strong-arm Seraphina or threaten her further, I'd be ready to push back. But I also knew that confronting him outright could backfire. Seraphina's fear wasn't unfounded, and the last thing I wanted was to make her situation worse. Later that week, Seraphina and I met at my apartment for another check-in. She looked exhausted, the stress of juggling 2 jobs and her financial mess taking a visible toll on her. As we went over her progress, I decided to broach the topic delicately. "I've been thinking about Max," I said carefully, "and I did some research." Her eyes widened. "What kind of research?" "Just enough to know that he's not as untouchable as he wants you to think," I said. "He's got his own problems. More debt than he lets on, a history of not paying people back. He's bluffing, Seraphina. He doesn't want attention drawn to himself." She looked both relieved and skeptical. "That might be true, but he's still unpredictable. What if he doesn't care? What if he decides to humiliate me anyway? Then we're ready for him," I said, my voice steady. "I've documented everything. If he makes a move, we can turn it back on him. But you have to trust me on this. We can't let him keep holding this over your head." She bit her lip, clearly torn. "I'm scared," she admitted. "But I don't want him to control me anymore." "You're not alone in this," I said, leaning forward. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together. You just have to be honest with me about everything. No more secrets." She nodded slowly, a spark of determination in her tired eyes. "Okay, no more secrets." It felt like a turning point, but I knew better than to let my guard down. Seraphina had taken the first step, but Max wasn't the type to go quietly. And as much as I wanted to believe the worst was behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real storm was still ahead. The following week, things took a darker turn. Seraphina called me late one evening, her voice trembling with panic. "He showed up at my apartment," she said, her words spilling out in a rush. "Max, he banged on my door and wouldn't leave. He kept shouting about the money." I gripped the phone tightly, fury bubbling to the surface. "Did he threaten you?" "Not exactly," she said, her voice breaking. "But he wouldn't stop yelling. He said I was running out of time and that he'd make me regret it if I didn't pay him back soon." "Seraphina, you need to call the police," I said firmly. "This is harassment." "No," she cried. "That'll only make things worse. You don't understand. Max doesn't back down. If I call the police, he'll find another way to get to me." Her fear was palpable, and it sent a chill down my spine. Max had officially crossed the line from being a nuisance to being a danger. I knew I couldn't wait for Seraphina to handle this on her own anymore. It was time to intervene. The next morning, I called in a favor from Evan, my friend in financial services. I told him everything, well, almost everything, and asked for advice. He recommended consulting a lawyer, especially since there was no formal agreement between Seraphina and Max. Without documentation, Max had no legal claim to the money. I relayed this to Seraphina, who seemed relieved but hesitant. "What if he doesn't care about what's legal?" she asked. "He's not the kind of person who plays by the rules." "Then we play smarter," I said. "If he tries anything, we'll have proof that he's harassing you. But you have to trust me and stay calm. Don't give him anything else to use against you." That same day, I started documenting everything. The texts and voicemails Max had sent her, the details of his visit to her apartment, and even the financial evidence I'd gathered from my research. If Max decided to escalate, I was determined to be ready. 2 days later, Max made his move. He showed up at the boutique where Seraphina worked, causing a scene in front of customers and her manager. He demanded to speak to her, shouting about how she owed him money and how she was trying to cheat him. Her manager, to their credit, escorted him out and threatened to call the police if he returned. When Seraphina called me in tears that night, I knew we had reached a breaking point. "He's ruining my life," she sobbed. "I can't do this anymore." "Yes, you can," I said firmly. "This ends now. We're going to confront him together." She hesitated. "You really think that'll work?" "It's not about whether it works," I said. "It's about taking back control. He's counting on your fear to keep you quiet. If we show him you're not afraid anymore, he'll back down." The next day, we met Max in a neutral location, a busy cafe downtown. Seraphina was visibly nervous, but I reassured her before we walked in. "Follow my lead," I said. "Don't let him intimidate you." Max was already seated, his smug expression grating on my nerves. As we approached, he leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "About time," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We're here to settle this," I said, sitting across from him. "But first, let's get one thing straight. You have no legal claim to the money." His smirk faltered, just slightly. "What are you talking about?" "There's no contract, no promissory note. Nothing binding," I continued. "If you try to take this any further, we'll involve the authorities, and you'll be the one in trouble for harassment." His confidence wavered, but he quickly recovered, leaning forward aggressively. "You think that scares me? I don't need a contract to get what's mine." I pulled out the file I had compiled, sliding it across the table. "This is everything we have on you, Max. Your unpaid debts, your history of borrowing and not paying people back, and now your harassment of Seraphina. If you keep pushing, this goes straight to the police and your creditors." For a moment he said nothing, his eyes scanning the papers with growing unease. Finally, he shoved the file back at me, his jaw tight. "You think you're so smart," he muttered. "Fine, keep the damn money, but don't think this is over." "It is over," I said firmly. "If you come near her again, you'll regret it." He stood abruptly, glaring at both of us before storming out. The tension in the air was so thick I could hardly breathe, but when I looked at Seraphina, I saw something I hadn't seen in weeks. Relief. The days that followed felt like stepping into a new chapter. With Max finally out of the picture, Seraphina began to rebuild in earnest. She stuck to her jobs, made consistent payments on her debts, and even started seeing a counselor to address the deeper issues behind her spending habits. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but it was progress. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful for her future. One evening, as we sat in my apartment going over her latest budget, she looked up at me with a shy smile. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. I don't know where I'd be if you hadn't stepped in." I smiled back, feeling a mixture of pride and exhaustion. "You'd have figured it out eventually," I said, "but I'm glad I could help." As she left that night, I realized something important. Helping Seraphina hadn't just been about fixing her mistakes. It had been about showing her she wasn't alone. And in the process, it had reminded me of the strength that comes from standing by the people you love, even when it's hard. Seraphina still had a long road ahead, but she was walking it with her head held high. And for the first time, I believed she'd make it to the other side.